Hello, did you miss me? I took a bit of time off to recharge, and I think I'm ready to get back into the swing of things. Speaking of which, let's have a teensy-weensy chat about art fixing. So recently there has been I want to say altercation, that sounds like the right word, between two artists revolving around the topic of, you guessed it, art fixing. So basically what happened is that a Tumblr user called Nonbinaryfinnmertins decided to fix an illustrated Spider-Man cover featuring Mary Jane, originally drawn by Scott Campbell. Scott is a pretty well-known artist who has done multiple illustrations for Marvel Comics over the course of his career. The fixed drawing was shared to Twitter and then blew up there, attracting the attention of the original artist himself. And the way that Scott responded to it was very smart. I do have to give him props for that, because he then fixed the drawing again and also made notes on the art that Non-Binary did as a means of giving them some tips. Scott did in fact note that the drawing is a number of years old and that his art has indeed gotten better since then, but this was where the situation got its traction because the notes he made came off to a number of people as a little bit passive-aggressive and even condescending. People were also quite upset about the comments he made towards his reasoning for putting Mary Jane in the particular post that he did. Essentially, it felt like he just wanted to get in a quick own without actually looking at the bigger picture. And the other thing about this situation is how divisive it's turned out to be for some people. On the one hand, you have people defending the original, stating that it's wrong to fix anyone's art for any reason and that people are allowed to have their own preference on what to draw. And I do agree with that. Going around and editing someone else's hard work feels a bit like a slap to the face. While on the other hand, people are seeing the point of why Non-Binary decided to do this, because over-sexualization of women in media is in fact a big problem, especially in comics. And Scott Campbell himself has been cited as having a hand in that. So what I want to do today is look into both sides of the argument and give my thoughts on not just this situation, but art fixing as a whole. We're going to be going through the notes written by Campbell in regards to the fix, and I'll be giving my personal thoughts on them. It's a bit of a rabbit hole, I'm not going to lie, and a big bulk of the discussion around art fixing most definitely comes down to things like interpretation, ethics, and preferences. I also want to just mention before I begin that you can obviously see that I'm also drawing Mary Jane in this video, but please note that I'm not trying to fix the picture. We don't need any more fixes. I just thought it would be fitting to try it out as a kind of draw this in your style kind of piece, so let me know if you like it. So without further ado, let's get into it. Let's start at the beginning. What is art fixing and why do people do it? Art fixing is when someone takes an original piece of media, usually drawings of characters in this case, and alters them in some way. It can be anything from lighting, colours, altering a pose or an aspect of the anatomy, or even redrawing/reinterpreting the piece completely. This kind of art fixing is usually done under the guise of the fixer wanting to improve the piece for whatever reason, for example, fixing an anatomical error, as was apparently the case with the Mary Jane piece. It can also often be seen with experienced artists giving advice to newer artists who may be asking for feedback, which is an instance where this kind of fixing is generally seen as acceptable. I tend to see this a lot in art discords where an artist will ask for ways to improve their drawing and someone else will draw over the piece showing where things need to be worked on. And this type of fixing is generally seen as okay because, well, the artist asked for it and they gave consent, plus it's also being used as a means to guide them on how to do it themselves. The other artist isn't taking it and doing it to mock how bad they are, it's a constructive method of learning. The kind of art fixing we're talking about today, however, is the type that is unwarranted and therefore falls into a question of ethics and morals. I think we've all at some point or other had a run-in with some stupid internet troll who goes mad with power after learning how to adjust colour values in Photoshop. A lot of people will fix art in order to mock others and are doing so in the hopes of a reaction, because they thrive on any attention given to them. But a problem we've been seeing crop up more recently is that regular people will be doing this kind of thing under the assumption that they are doing it for the right reasons. As people's opinions change on things such as racial diversity, LGBTQ acceptance, and body positivity, these instances can cause people to want to include these aspects into more popular media. And when that media doesn't deliver, well, if you want something done, you have to do it yourself. This ends up being the reason for things like queer shipping in fanfiction, race/gender bending of popular characters, and so on. And 99% of the time, these people are not fixing the art, they're just reinterpreting it and aren't doing so maliciously. More often than not, they're actually big fans of the media in question and just want to see a little bit more of themselves represented in their favourite characters, and honestly, who can blame them? This in itself is not the problem. People are completely free and within their right to do these things. I think where this starts to become a bit of a grey area though is when people start to take these interpretive ideas as gospel, and insist on them being the status quo to the point where people are no longer allowed to draw certain characters in the way that they want to. This type of gatekeeping can also be a really bad breeding ground for malicious trolling, especially for marginalised creators and characters. A good example of this issue is when a Japanese artist made some human gijinkas of the Sonic the Hedgehog crew, which was really cute and good, but then another artist decided unequivocally that Knuckles the Echidna was in fact canonically dark-skinned, despite being an echidna. and decided to fix this artist drawing without their consent. Look, there is no problem with having a preferred interpretation of a character, and it's not uncommon for communities to collectively agree that characters are appealing when drawn in certain ways that deviate from canon. But when it infringes upon someone else's freedom of interpretation and creativity to the point where you are defacing someone else's work, that is when we start to have a problem. Another prominent example is when fellow YouTube artist Thumin drew herself as Kiki from Kiki's Delivery Service because she enjoys and relates to the character. So why shouldn't she be allowed to do that? Well, because of racism, apparently. Again, this not only infringed upon her freedom of interpretation, but it instead went in the opposite direction and just completely opened the floodgates for trolls and racists to think that it was appropriate to be downright horrid to her in the name of preserving canon. Thumin has now made 2 videos on the subject, one which brought to light the intense amount of harassment she got, and another which goes into the aftermath of it all after she reached out to other creators for help. I would recommend watching both of these if you can, and I will provide links below. I would also just like to mention that things like screen cap redraws and fan art do not fall into the category of art fixing. When we talk about fixing, it becomes very clear that it is usually a matter of intent. There's a very visible difference between a person going around fixing other artists' works claiming the originals to be terrible, and another person saying, I really like this, so I drew it with a personal twist. The first makes people feel like garbage, and the second one is practically harmless. There are obviously a few more variables that occur on a case-by-case basis, but that's more or less the gist. So, with what I've just explained in mind, what's the big issue with the Mary Jane piece? So, the reason behind Non-Binary's art fix of Mary Jane was that they believed that she looked too sexualized. If we look at Scott's original image and the art fix side by side, you can see that the primary changes were things like MJ's bust size and posing. The bust was reduced to an admittedly less back-breaking size, and the leg was moved down. Now, the major problem with this, aside from the fact that Non-Binary fixed someone's art without consent, is that being sexy isn't a bad thing, but speaking as a fellow artist and also a woman, I do kind of have an idea of where they were coming from. People are more than happy to have sexy characters in media. I don't think MJ being perceived as such is the problem. I think the main issue is simply that the attitude and people's standards around how to portray sexiness has changed. Like, look at Lady Dimitrescu from Resident Evil 8 for example. She is an 8-foot-tall, thick vampire lady, but the difference between her and MJ is the way the two are framed. Lady Dimitrescu is framed as dangerous and intimidating, and her sex appeal is more of a bonus to the perception of her overall character. Whereas MJ is clearly seen in the original Spider-Man cover pushing up her bust with her arms to draw attention to them. This is what's known as performative sex appeal. And this kind of performative sexiness is something that has been brought up regarding Scott Campbell's work a few times. In 2016, Scott's variant cover of The Invincible Iron Man issue 1 was pulled from shelves for allegedly over-sexualizing a 15-year-old character Riri Williams. I'm not too familiar with his career or Scott himself as a person, but I am trying to give both sides the most charitable view that I can for the sake of the video. I can only really go off of what I've recently seen and read about him, and I'm sad to say that I don't exactly have the best first impression. A character being perceived as sexy and having desirable traits like long legs and a big bust is fine, it's normal, but you can have those things without being in a compromising pose, much less exhibit that pose on a comic book cover of a franchise that has a very large audience of children and teens. I can only really speak for myself regarding the original image, but it does indeed feel kind of alienating in terms of seeing women as people. But that said, as Scott mentioned when he responded to the fix, this cover is some years old now and his art skills have since improved, which was part of the reason he decided to refix the fix. So let's now take a look at some of the things he wrote in response to Non-Binary's art fix, as well as his own. Okay, so the first point is actually a decent tidbit regarding the elbow. Given the angle of the arm, the elbow does look a bit twisted and juts out a bit unnaturally, so this was a good bit of advice on his part. The second one is to do with MJ's clavicle bones, aka the collarbones. This is also a good tip, as they are in fact way too high given the angle of the shot, but then he feels the need to preface this with some really weird energy, and this was the case with the first note as well. I feel like I have to reiterate here that while I think some of his wording is in poor taste, if it had been my art that was fixed, I would also be quite passive-aggressive, so I'm not ragging on him for that. I think that's completely understandable. I'm more concerned about the fact that he's speaking this way as a renowned artist with a large online following to what is probably a teenager with less than 1% of his reach. With great power comes great responsibility, dude. The third point is to do with the t-shirt and breast size. I agree that the styling of the shirt is most definitely down to preference, but when it comes to him talking about the swimsuit effect of the shirt and that they typically involve wrinkling, tucking, and fabric pulling, I feel that it's important to mention that he has also fallen prey to suctioning clothes onto characters in order to achieve the opposite effect of this, and this is also a very noticeable hallmark of his work. Moving on, this next one I actually disagree with heavily, and I'm gonna read it out. I I can't help but notice that rather than looking cozied and relaxed onto the couch with her warm coffee as in the original, the MJ instead now has the energy of a perky obedient puppy. This doesn't seem to be the MJ I know, but who am I to say? Okay, first of all, I can't exactly speak for your friend who allegedly sat like this all the time and inspired you like you keep telling people, but I attempted this pose sitting on my bed, and while it was doable, it is not relaxed or cozy by any stretch. In fact, I could only really sit like that for about a minute, and when I finally moved, my hip made a very loud and concerning clicking noise. It wouldn't surprise me if your friend was actually double jointed or something, but even then, I can't imagine she was doing her back any favours sitting like that. Also, she's sitting upward, and that doesn't really strike me as a relaxed pose either. In fact, neither of the poses by Scott or Nonbinary have MJ looking like she's actually relaxing on the couch, which makes sense in a way, because she is glancing out of the window. But yeah, this one just seemed a bit hypocritical to me, like wanting to draw a certain pose is completely fine, but don't say that it's a certain thing when it isn't. The final one, again, is about posing, specifically the legs. As I stated before, I tried the pose out and it isn't impossible. Uncomfortable, but not impossible. He also notes that the new pose is somewhat static, unimaginative, and boring. And while I do agree to an extent that it is kind of boring, I think this one can be contested down to the actual character's personality. Mary Jane does have an extroverted personality in public, but she also has a lot of traumatic baggage behind closed doors. So I don't think either pose is right or wrong in this instance. So those were all of the comments regarding the fix done by Nonbinaryfinnmertins. Now let's take a look at what Scott said about his own fix. In the top paragraph, he explains that he kept the original pose but added a more relaxed curve to the spine, and it works really well. She actually looks like she's reclining onto the couch a bit more, which is great. He also notes that the new pose of her having one leg slightly on top of the other works better while still retaining that bit of sexiness, which is absolutely fine. Further down, he goes on to mention the arms and states that he was attempting a pose similar to a stretching cat in the original that pushed her back into the couch. I can kind of see the stretching part, but again, she doesn't really look anywhere near the back of that couch in the original, and I feel like this was an instance of Scott trying to defend something that probably seemed right to him but was never actually that clear to the audience. He then goes on to say that he kept the more conservative shirt fit, but then stated that he added back in some wrinkles and shadows to the back and chest area. This is completely fine, and I didn't think the fit of the shirt on either piece was that big of a deal, but one section that kinda made my skin crawl a little bit was when he said that leaving the chest area undefined is a travesty, and tries to justify it under the guise of not being able to put in much detail when it comes to line art. Again, the actual breast size and perceived sexiness of the character isn't the problem, it's the aspect of performative sexiness that puts people off, especially considering Scott's a guy. Also, I kinda coined on to the fact that he thinks this is a small bust. It's not. This reminds me so much of the Final Fantasy remake announcement where people went absolutely ballistic about Tifa's chest size being supposedly reduced in the 3D model. Like, my god, a character can still be sexy with small or undefined boobs, it's not a travesty. Get a grip. The point on the left was about the coffee smoke and was largely uncontested, so we'll leave that one alone. And the final paragraph is him stating that he feels like he hit a good middle ground between his own style and the more conservative styling that Nonbinary brought to the table. I will say that I like this piece a lot more than the original and the fix. I think it's very nice. There's not really much I can say that hasn't already been said about it. I'm not even gonna touch the final little note at the bottom, so those are my thoughts on everything said in Scott's fixing notes. Overall, I think in this situation there was fault on both sides. Nonbinary shouldn't have fixed another person's art no matter how well known the artist is or how terrible they think the original art was. Defacing anything that doesn't belong to you is just really bad form, and I can't help but feel this whole situation could have been avoided so easily by just not doing that. And Scott didn't even really need to respond. This art fix obviously wasn't impacting his career or anything, so the fact that he brought attention to it and actually gave people ammunition to use against him was really his own fault, to be honest. He's old enough and big enough to be able to shrug something off like this with a throwaway statement, so playing into this whole behaviour just came off as really catty for an industry professional. I also personally didn't appreciate his choice of wording in his response, despite empathising with the fact that having your art fixed does cause you to get a bit defensive. As I said before, Scott has a large amount of eyes on him, and the way anyone with an audience conducts themselves has a knock-on effect that can enable people to behave in various ways. The main takeaway is, don't fix people's art. It just gives everyone involved a headache. Also, sexy characters are fine, just don't have them bending over or something just to try and prove that. But anyway, thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and subscribe. What do you guys think about art fixing? Do you think I was too harsh to one or the other? Do you think I wasn't harsh enough? Whatever your opinion is, please let me know in the comments, and I will speak to you soon. Stay safe, everyone. Bye!